Dan, I want to ask you about the kind of psychology of this main event, right? I think it's kind of interesting. Like, you got Marlon, who probably should have had a title shot and didn't get it. You know, he won the fight and there was schedule and all that. So I want to start with him. What do you think his mindset is coming in here? Does he feel like anger, and is that good to have that, or is that bad to be in that mindset?
It's an interesting situation. I mean, yesterday he just seemed very calm, and I don't know whether that's him trying to just let me focus on this fight and get this one won, because I mean, he's made such a case to be in there for the belt. The frustration's got to be there. It's got to be there, and I would imagine there's a few. I mean, Aljamain Sterling must be feeling fairly frustrated as well, and I would imagine that a lot of guys are kind of looking at this situation and thinking, I want to get back there. I want to get back there, especially because I mean, Peter Yan looked fantastic, didn't he? He looked fantastic, and what a fight that would be. With Marlon being a striker, I would imagine, even as a striker, you lose a fight and you watch the fight back and you're like, I have no ways I can beat this guy, and I would imagine that Marlon's in that same situation. Moving to a new camp is a signifier that he felt like he needed to shake some things up, and it. Sometimes fighters just seem like they get a bit too comfortable in a particular place, and what Marlon's been hinting at to me certainly is that it's difficult to spar with people that you're such good friends with, and because Mark Henry had such a tight crew, everyone's working with each other every day, friendly every day. You get to the stage where you don't want to punch him in the face too much. Right. Whereas now he's down at ATT. I mean, that mat is rammed with people, all different sizes, all different skills. I just think he's got some more realistic sparring now, and I think that's what he was needing. We know Marlon's a devastating striker. He's an excellent Thai boxer, and back working with his old coach as well, I think that's probably reinvigorated some of those old combinations. But at the same time, he'll take stuff from Mark Henry and apply it to that. So he's probably in a better place than he ever has been. And yeah, yesterday there was just something that stood out to me, because he had like this little treat pot, because obviously he's on a tight diet. And he had this. It was like a chocolate mousse or something. And we'd ask him a question, and sometimes he was just completely lost in this part. And he was like really taking his time. And then he'd like think about it, and he was real matter of fact about it. He seems like he's in a very good place. And what was nice is that he was very honest about what he's up against with Sandhagen. He's tall, he's rangy, he's difficult to get in on, he's unpredictable. So I think he's doing the right thing and just not trying to look too far ahead. Because even if you're right in position for a title shot, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get one,
Yeah. And then the flip side with Corey, I wonder what his mindset's like, right? Because he was like the guy. Like, everybody's paying attention to him, and he's on this, astronomical ride, and he goes out and gets shut down really fast. Where's his head at now coming back? I mean, does he feel like, am I really that guy, or was I not as good as I thought I was, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's actually had the opposite effect. I think he knows he's that guy, and I think the last fight made him realise he's that guy, and he wasn't acting like himself. If you look at his career, he was on a streak of stopping everybody, and he was looking great as well. And then he ran into a couple of guys, Lineker and the Sunsao, and it slowed down a bit. And it wasn't. I mean, obviously competition's gotten higher, but he also kind of pulled back a little bit, because these are really good guys. So if I'm beating them doing this, why would I change it? And I think he's realised that he's got a killer instinct, and that's something that you can trust in there if you've got it. And I think the hesitation going into those fights, even though he came out with the split and the unanimous decision, I think that followed over into the Sterling fight, and he just wasn't himself. And as frustrating as that was for him, I don't think it's going to slow him down. I think he realises that if he just goes in there and just kind of free flows and expresses himself as he is, that his killer instinct will actually do him some favours.
Nice. Is there any other fight on the card that's caught your attention, whether it be like a story of a fighter or like the stylistic matchup, or one that you're really looking forward to?
Honestly, I mean, I could give you a list. There's a bunch. I mean, the heavyweights, Chris Daukaus and Nascimento. You've got. I mean, it is literally a striker v grappler matchup. Although the secret weapon is that Daukaus has got his black belt, so he's legit on the floor as well, and he's got wicked hands and fast hands for the weight class. I'm very excited to see Duplessis in the UFC. 1-on-1 with Soldic. Soldic is a Terminator, and both fights. Watch those back to back. They're great fights. Both of them could have gone either way. And he's just in a position where I kind of feel like his time in EFC had ran its course, because he was the champ. He got the welterweight belt. He went up and took the middleweight belt in 90 seconds off Yannick, and then he was kind of waiting around to fight Dalcha Lungiambula, who then got signed to the UFC. He's got just such a good energy, good air about him, and he's coming in against Marcus Perez, who's going to really push him. An aggressive, a bit of a wild man. Duplessis is legit. He's a good striker, good K1 background, judo background as well. And he's also, I mean, I was listening to an interview the other day, he's already talking about facing Chris Weidman as soon as possible. Like, he wants to get up into the top 5 pretty quick. And that's someone that feels like they've done their work outside of the UFC. And I know that feeling because, I mean, I signed at 25 fights into my career. You know, you kind of get to the stage where you're like, okay, I've had all the lessons outside the UFC. Now let me get to where I need to be and start competing with. So you're not going through all the guys in the, you know, the top 20 to get there. The fight for me is Youssef Zalal against Ilia Topuria, though. I can't see how that's going to go, because on one side you've got Youssef, who he's a power pack. I mean, he never stops. He was running around the walls in the fighter meeting yesterday. Like, I actually asked him to check his heart rate, and he was like 140 sitting there having a conversation. He's electric. He's never stopping smiling and moving, and that comes out in his fights. I mean, I know he's got 3 decisions, and that's a bit frustrating for him. But he almost got Garrett out there with that back kick to the face. I think that he's a real talent, and I think he needs to kind of realise himself in the octagon. And now he's had those fights. I think he's at that stage where he can start putting his finishing combinations together. Obviously, his work rate's ridiculous as well. And then on the other side, you've got Ilia, who I remember watching him fight Brian Boulogne at Cage Warriors 94, and he just ran through him. And he's done that to everybody he's faced. You know, he's 2-3 years a black belt now. He's got a Greco-Roman background. And all the way through his career up to this point, we've seen him, he takes people down, he attacks the neck immediately, and they really can't put a great deal of offensive up against it. Until the last fight, and the guy stuffed, you know, a couple of his takedowns, certainly defended a couple of his chokes, and then he knocked him out with a single punch. So we now know he's got 1-punch knockout power if he needs it as well, but he just doesn't seem to want to use it. It's like, well, you know, I mean, it's there if I need it, but I want to choke these guys out. So you've got a fast worker, a guy that starts fast, making his UFC debut on this real streak. A lot of hype behind him against Zalal, who's now starting to realise himself in the UFC, who's got the gas tank to really push him. That's the fight for me.
Nice. Last thing for me, I want to ask if you saw the memes going around of like you and Carlos Condit, you know, like putting you back together.
Yeah, he looks no different.
Right?
How is that? He looks no different. I look 20 years older and it's only been 10 years.
Well, I want to ask you, so you've obviously seen them. Any interest in that fight? And, you know, you told us before, you said, I'm going to start having those conversations while I'm here. So have any conversations been had? Is that one that you'd be willing to revisit?
Yeah, absolutely I would, of course. I mean, it's the only time I've ever been stopped with strikes in a fight. And as a striker, that was rather embarrassing. I mean, I laughed at it at the time, but of course, I look back and I'm like, that was stupid of me. I learned so many lessons in that fight. You know, this I felt, and I spoke about this regarding Dominic Reyes. When you come off a fight against the world champion, I mean, I didn't do well against GSP, but I got to 25 minutes, and then I spent the next 4 or 5 months traveling around the US, and everyone was going, a little bit of takedown defense and you'll be fine. So then I'm looking at everybody else in the division, especially Condit as a striker, and I'm thinking, well, you're not GSP, so you're not going to take me down. What do you got to offer me? And I just had complete disregard for his striking power, which was my mistake. And you can watch that fight. I mean, I stepped in 3 times through the same left hook because I'd caught him a little earlier in the fight, and I saw his eyes spin one time, and I thought, yeah, I've got his number, I've got his range now. And I got too eager to chase after it, and he set me up perfectly. You know, you watch his strikes, he mixes them up really nicely, and he caught me clean on a counter. And it was, I still hear about it from my coach. He still pokes fun at me and laughs about it. Yeah, of course. You know, he looked great the other night, and that's really what I wanted to see from him, because I do genuinely believe that he's up there with, you know, the Nick Diaz, Masvidal kind of guys in this division. He's a lethal individual. He's a natural born killer. You know, he's a great striker. He's very unorthodox, and he's back in a place psychologically as well as physically where he looks like he can have some good fights, and who would not want payback for the only person that knocked him out? Absolutely.
Have you had any talks with the UFC?
No. I've not seen anybody. I've been hiding in my room.
Fair play. Quarantine.
Yes, of course. Self-quarantine.
There you go. I wanted to ask you, as an ex-fighter and as an analyst, how much stock do you put in the importance of a corner person for a fighter?
I mean, for me not to say they're essential would be foolish of me. They are essential, and for 2 different ways. One, what they bring to the table when they're in the corner, and I don't want to disrespect anybody, but I felt like the main event of the weekend, they needed some adaptation in Aldana's corner, and I just didn't hear anything, you know. And that's what concerns me, is when the corner doesn't have a great deal to offer as far as advice as to, look, this is what you're up against, maybe try this. And the thing is, when you're outside of the octagon, and I mean, I've cornered lots of people. You see things that they don't. You know, you're in the moment, the adrenaline's going. You're so focused on your opponent that you're sometimes creating a narrative that maybe isn't there, and you can also be sticking to a game plan that's not working for you as well. And that is where a good corner team comes in. It would be able to like either pull you out of that funk and get you turned around, give you some advice or something different to try, or sometimes just get out of the way. And I know that's a stupid thing to say, but how many corner teams have you seen getting in the fighter's way? As soon as they sit down on the stool, they're trying to pour water in their mouth when they're gasping for air. They're in their face, all panicked. And I've had that as well. I've had good corner teams and bad corner teams. I had one corner man that I would sit down on the stool and he would try and get as many "don't do this" in as he could in 60 seconds. And I start the next round, I'm like, so what do I do? What do I do then? Because okay, you've told me everything I shouldn't do. Now what should I do? And that's where a corner team comes in. You need someone that's is this relating to Darren Till cornering Mike Perry? I thought it was. I thought we were going this direction. I can't wait to see that for a start. It's essential. You know, you need to trust the person, but you also need to. They also need to know you well enough to know what you need in the corner, and oftentimes that's time spent on the mat with them.
So I'm not trying to just throw Mike under the bus here, but let's assume Darren Till doesn't get that position, because if Darren did get that position, he'd be at least qualified for it. But if Mike's auctioning off a place in his corner to like a random fan, is that something the commission needs to be like, no, you can't do that?
No. I mean, if he wants to do it, he can do it. My concern is that he'd have a random fan and his missus and no legitimate, educated voice in the corner. I mean, I'd probably still prefer that than Diego Sanchez's corner, but that's another story altogether. I mean, that's what I'm talking about with the person getting out of the way, and I don't mean getting out of the way of a knife. You need a voice in your corner. I mean, I've travelled around the world fighting with one corner man, and I went out to Japan. I'd fought in a tournament in Japan with my old Thai boxing coach Owen Comrie, who had no real idea of jiu-jitsu. So I told him what to tell me when I was in bad situations on the ground, because I was fighting a 10th Planet guy who wants to tie me up in rubber guard. And you can go back and listen to that fight, and you can hear him shouting, "Posture up, posture up." I don't even think he really knew what he was saying, but you know, I'd coached him to coach me. But obviously, the rest of his instructions were absolutely on point. And just one good corner person can make a massive, massive difference. And my concern for Mike is that he's not going to have anybody, and that's a concern. I mean, I was happy to see Stephan Bonner in the corner of Sanchez, but even so, it's, you know. You need a voice of reason and logic in the corner, and you also need someone that you can trust. So when someone says, "Hey, try this," you're not going to question them before you get into the next round and try it. And you know, faith in the corner team is a big thing.
So Till and Perry, probably that trust might not be there.
Yeah, the truth is, knowing Darren Till as a fighter, when he gets in that corner, for all the hot air and nonsense that he talks, when he gets in that fight with Mike Perry, he'll corner him like a good corner man. He will, because it's his instinct. I could corner anybody. It doesn't matter whether I like them or not. If I feel like I can help them win the fight, I will tell them, because that's my job as a corner man. And Darren Till's old school. I know he'll do that. If he's in that corner, he'll give Mike Perry good advice.
So do you find the benefit of having one head coach, like, say John Jones might have Brandon Gibson is striking, Izzy Martinez would be his wrestling, but then Greg Jackson is the overarching coach. Unlike Tony Ferguson, who seems to have a bunch of specialized coaches without one overarching voice. You are leaning towards one kind of one coach, head coach, right?
It really depends on the dynamic of the corner team, and I think we've got no better example than Holly Holm's corner team at the weekend, because they all play their own individual roles, but they're all on the same page when it comes to the game plan. And that is the best corner team you can have, when you've got three specialists that have all got their own knowledge and expertise in different ranges, but they also all see what everybody else does in the corner and the value, and not talking over one another. I mean, you go into that corner and it's Greg Jackson, or Mike Winklejohn goes, Greg Jackson goes, and then Izzy goes, and they have a nice little balance. Everyone's succinct. They give them exactly what advice they need to, that's relevant to their part, and then they leave them to go out and put it together themselves. The issue, I mean, I had this issue sometimes as well, when I would have three corner men that didn't see each other in training camp, because that was the dynamic of training back in the day. So I've got a kickboxing coach telling me to keep it standing and trade. I've got a jiu-jitsu guy telling me to take him down and choke him out. You know what I mean? I've got a clinch guy telling me a wrestling guy telling me to keep him up against the fence and clinch them. It's like, that's the problem when you've got too much information coming in. As long as all the information is going down the same path, it doesn't matter whether it's from one head corner man or a bunch of specialists. It's more relevant when they're in the corner, and again, that's where the Jackson Wink team do so well, is that they take it in turns to speak. No one's yelling over one another and giving contradictory advice.
Well, Holly, I think she's been at Jackson's her whole career, but then you see fighters that want to bounce around from camp to camp to camp. Do you think it's just because like Holly might be a special like example because she's been with that team so much? Well, like Mike Perry's trained at Jackson's and then he went back to Florida and then he had no coach and so on and so forth. Like, there's got to be some balance, right?
Yeah, there has to be. I mean, some fighters are nomadic. They just kind of move around and drift, and you know, they do try different things, and some things work, some things don't. I mean, you know, some fighters just don't need a corner team at all, and that, you know, that's their feeling. I still feel like there's a benefit in having a logical voice in the corner that point things out that you can't. But who does that is really down to what trust you put in that individual. You know, it's the same with Mark Henry in that corner. You've got Mark Henry on one side, you've got Ricardo Almeida on the other, kind of giving both sides of the game plan. And then obviously you've got Ray Longo and Matt Serra, who are both just basically on the same page, thinking the same things and saying the same things. I mean, it's horses for courses, isn't it? It's, you know, it's down to the individual fighter and what they need. And I think Holly's a good example of someone that walked into the right gym at the very beginning of her career and found the right team. And there are so many fighters out there that drift from one team to the next and just don't find what they're looking for. And that may be just the situation of the sport at the moment, with there not being enough people that have been MMA fighters or have been around MMA long enough to understand what it takes to be in the corner.
Talking about this week's main event and the current champ, Peter Yan, who do you think presents the most danger stylistically for Peter, Corey or Marlon?
I would probably say, I mean, and this is completely off the cuff, I'd like to probably give this a bit more thought, but my first initial thought is Corey, mainly because of his footwork and his length. The thing that Peter Yan does so well is he forces people back up against the fence with good footwork without actually doing anything. Like with Peter Yan, there's always the threat that something's going to happen. I mean, his work rate's very low, but his presence is terrifying, and I think that's what people respond to when he's in there. They get backed up against the fence, and they really kind of don't know what's coming, and it makes them uncomfortable. You know, you watch him against Jimmy Rivera, he just cuts him down against the fence, and I mean, I think he's got a very, very high level operating system, and I think you need someone that's not only got the footwork and striking skills to deal with it, but also the ability to move through range as quick as he does. And Marlon's an excellent Thai boxer, but he's a very traditional Thai boxer. He's predominantly orthodox, almost always orthodox. He's got good footwork, but he's very fundamentally sound. He doesn't use anything particularly flamboyant. Whereas Corey's got that kind of Dominic Cruz sprinkling to his footwork, where he's able to step through southpaw to orthodox. And given the fact that he's taller and longer than Peter Yan as well, when Yan's moving forward switching stance, if Corey can move back switching stance, he'd be able to catch him on the counter. That's the most problematic fight for him, I think, just purely because he's able to fight from both stances and move as well as Yan. Marlon Moraes will probably most likely look like fighters that Peter Yan's training against, so it's a bit easier to read his movement patterns.
You tweeted one of these days, I think it was yesterday, about you were researching about fighters that are making their debut and how exciting it is. Well, back in the day we didn't have like the internet and all of that to find out about all the fighters, but I want to know how special it is for the guys that are making their debut, and how important it is to have fighters and commentators that are fighters or former fighters.
I think it's very important because, I mean, the thing is, everybody that stepped into the octagon knows what it's like to try and get to the UFC. You know, we've all been on that journey on the way up, and we all know what it's like to take fights and get fights pulled out, and, you know, opponents go missing and stuff, and the frustrations leading up to the UFC. So there's a lot more to be gleaned from a fighter's career than just who they fought and how they won those fights. The journey that they've been on. I mean, you know, I'll go back to Cameron Else. Obviously, he didn't have a great UFC debut, but his UFC debut was very similar to every one of his other fights in his career. Like, he's a short notice fighter. He's always brought in to take on the big challenge, the guy in his hometown, you know, the guy that's supposed to win the fight, etc., etc. Then there are other guys that have been in one promotion and they've been fed cans their whole life, and they step over to the UFC, and I look at I can look at an undefeated record, and I mean, one thing that I do, which this is a good little trick, and this was something I used to kind of settle nerves of my fighters if they're going into fights. I'll look, and Tapology is great for this. I'll look down a fighter's record, and I'll add the records together of everybody that they've faced to kind of see what standard of fighter they're up against. I mean, I was cornering a fighter a few weeks ago, and his opponent, he was 7-0 with an accumulated record in his opponents of 7-46. You know what I mean? So it's not just a winning record. It's not just an unbeaten record. There's a story to it, and there's always a narrative that you can get from it. And oftentimes you can see people if people come to the UFC without an undefeated record, you can usually kind of see where the kinks in their game are and what led them to dropping those fights. And as former fighters, we can put ourselves in that place, and we can dig into those things and understand the ins and outs of the sport, and what it feels like to be struggling to get opponents, or what it feels like to be pulled onto an event where you're fighting a guy that he's basically just fed cans the whole time in his career to build him up to get to the UFC. As much as some people step into the UFC with good records, I'd rather a guy that's 5-5 that's been through some really, really tough opponents. And that's why I'm excited for Duplessis this weekend, because I look at his record and I know he's fought some really good guys. I'll say it again, Soldic is a very good guy. Yannick Bahati is a very good guy. He's a big, strong middleweight. He also fought Gareth McLennan, who we've seen in the UFC. And that's another thing, if they've already faced fighters that are in the UFC or have been in the UFC, that gives me a good idea of their standard. And I think that's important. As analysts, we need to take everything into account.